Hi everybody, Austin here with coming at you with another episode of the Teachers Starting Fires podcast. Today we're going to answer the question that every teacher encounters at some point in their career. It goes a little something like this. Why do I have to learn this stuff? We're going to answer every question you have about that.
Hey everybody, Jesse with Teachers Starting Fires here. Just want to throw out real quick, we had some kind of issue with my microphone today, and there's a few weird clicks and pops throughout my audio track. Austin thankfully recorded just fine, but we have changed the audio a little bit, and hopefully it will take care of the problem. Also, if you are interested in learning any more about our free coaching program, which we'll discuss at the very end of the program, you can find out more at www.tsfires.com/invitation. Hope you guys enjoy the podcast.
Welcome back, everybody. And if you've been a teacher for more than 2 days, you've probably encountered this question from one of your students, wondering why they have to learn this particular thing, whether it's the Pythagorean theorem, which I don't know why everyone picks on the Pythagorean theorem. I'm a big fan of it myself. Whether it's that, your students think it's not a real world skill, or maybe it's something else. And not every teacher has a good answer right away to get their students to value the knowledge that they're trying to teach. So it was inspiring for Jesse and us to come up with our approach to the answer to this question. So Jesse, when you saw this, what came to mind?
Yeah, this is a question I heard a whole lot, especially in several years at the Title I school that I taught at. A lot of those students, not only, just come from backgrounds where those type of really academic things are not discussed very much, but also a lot of them by senior year, their fourth or fifth or sixth year in high school, they knew what kind of job they were going into. I think our school, being a at-risk school focused on kids that had dropped out in the past, only had like a maybe 3% rate of going on to a college, especially a four-year degree. A lot of technical schools, a lot of kids that already had been working in certain jobs for years by the time that they graduated. So all the time students would come up and say like, hey, what is the purpose of this? For a couple of years I was the science teacher there, so what's the purpose of knowing about Earth's plates or the weather, or especially some of the more like, when am I ever going to have to figure out what kind of rock this is? Because I don't deal with rocks, I fix cars, that kind of idea. It definitely struck home, and I know I had to answer this question to a whole lot of students over a lot of different subjects, especially too then when I was push an interventionist pretty much in every subject, because I was kind of the teacher helping and not the main teacher. I think even more students kind of asked me what is the point of this? Why am I learning this? Kind of on the side of the classroom.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the education system isn't necessarily doing us any favors as teachers, because, and in your case, the education system says, oh, your path is to go to school, graduate from high school, then go to college or get a good job. But for a lot of your students, their reality wasn't on that path, so they struggled even more.
Right, right. Yeah, and I think maybe some of the I guess more like middle class, higher performing schools I had student taught at, you still ran into a lot of teachers that just said, well, because I said so, or it's for the test, or because that's what we're doing today. And maybe at those, again, kind of like middle class or middle SES schools, more of the students had kind of been given this education as important thing from their parents. And so they might roll their eyes a little bit, but they'd be like, all right, I guess that's what we're doing today. But yeah, like you said, especially, I think that the standard answer that we give, especially, even like what's the point of having a 12-year school system in our country kind of thing, way too often, whether directly or sort of indirectly, the answer that we give is like, well, you have to do this so that you can get a good grade, so that you can be ready for the tests, so that you can get into a good college, so that you can get a good job, so that you can save for retirement, so that you can finally retire, in a good retirement home, and then you can afford a good casket, is essentially
Wow.
what we tell students.
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
the American
yeah,
dream,
it's
right? Something like that.
yeah. Everybody's aspiring for a white picket fence and a really nice casket. But yeah, like you said, at my school especially, a lot of the students that came up, they already knew very much that like their future did not include college. And the other big one is like some of that we have to base off, and we know the statistics. Of course, having a high school diploma and having a college diploma is much better than not having those, right? Just in terms of statistics. But most of these students had 99%, if not 100% of the adults in their life, apart from their teachers, did not have college degrees and still had various levels of success. Like they were all alive, they were all surviving. So students would come in and be like, essentially it is the like every single successful adult I know who's not a teacher does not have a college degree. Most of them don't even have a high school diploma. So, why do I have to do this? Because I don't really have any interest in a college degree or in the education that I'm getting. I'm just kind of doing this because there's social pressure and I'm supposed to be here, or, the court system says I have to be here. So the question, very much is that like, how does this apply to me? What am I doing here?
Yeah. Well, and then sometimes you get teachers who want to empathize with their students and they might say, well, yeah, you're right. This isn't relevant outside of school, but you still have to learn it. So buckle up. Right.
Um,
Basically, they're undermining the whole purpose of being there by
right.
saying
Yeah,
that.
yeah. And I absolutely agree with that. I've definitely heard the teacher, I imagine we all have that, I guess wants to be the cool kids. And I mean, I remember a college professor I had that, uh, basically dressed like they were way younger. And then at the same time, I was in a political theory class, and we were reading. I think it was Aristotle or Socrates via Plato kind of thing. But essentially said, beware of the teacher that tries to act like the student, because they haven't actually grown enough to be teaching. And I was like, oh, okay. That reminds me a lot.
Oh, that's a good
Yeah,
one.
yeah, I thought it was excellent. And it was, I guess I was often surprised at how insecure some college professors felt. And I guess there's a lot of pressure to feel like you're one of the cool college students, which is weird if you already have a PhD in that subject and, a successful career and all that. But yeah, I've heard the high school and middle school teachers try to be on the side of the student and basically say like, hey, you're right, this subject is kind of dumb, or, this one category is dumb, but we just have to learn it, so work with me. And like that does build a relationship with the student, but it undermines the entire educational process. That if you're like, your approach to answering the question is to say like, you're right, school's dumb, even if you don't think that's what you're saying, you should maybe watch out for that.
And the other thing that I was thinking about with this question, and I don't think that any teacher has actually said this to their class, but I know that they're thinking it. That they're thinking in response to the question of why do I have to learn this, they're thinking, well, you have to learn this because that's what my pay raise is based off of next year when you do well on the test. So if I want to keep my job and get money, then you need to learn this. Which is kind of it's a
Right,
sad
right.
result of the education system these days, right?
Well, yeah, and I think a lot of the performance-based pay is a lovely idea, depending on how you measure performance and all that, and that's like a whole nother can of worms as well. And then you've run into some teachers, you were saying before we started this too, where they kind of just say like it's their job to teach, right?
Right. The teachers are. It's like the teachers have adopted the students' mentality, like, well, the students are obligated to be here, and I'm obligated to be here, so let's just tough it out.
Yeah, and I've seen, I mean, even on Reddit, in response to similar posts, I've definitely seen teachers basically saying like, it doesn't matter if your students aren't interested, it's your job to teach, whatever your subject is, and it's their job to learn whatever your subject is, and it really doesn't matter if they don't care, because that's on them. And I mean, I can't
Yeah,
imagine,
yeah.
like, yes, maybe they learn math because you forced them to, but really what they're learning is that, like, they learn whatever you're modeling. So if you're modeling that it doesn't matter if they care about what they're doing, like to me, you're setting up a giant future generation of citizens who thinks it's okay to go through life completely uninterested in what you're doing and disliking what you're doing. And those are the teachers where maybe teaching's not really your thing if you're convinced that like all you need to do is get kids to spit out facts, then you've become like a weird form of Wikipedia that makes students uninterested.
Yeah, it's like a great way to create a generation of people hooked on antidepressants.
Yeah, well, and I think those teachers are the teachers that make um, those are the teachers that make like the increase of essentially robots taking teaching jobs, which to me is one of the jobs that could least be replaced by a robot, but seems to be where we're often headed is that more and more you see that idea of a classroom where it's like, well, everybody plugs into the computer and the computer walks them through the curriculum. And it's like, well, right, if your only purpose is to read like Wikipedia and then spit it back out, then teachers are unnecessary, which is why, teachers need to be doing more than just getting students to memorize facts, I think.
Right. So let's talk about where we go from here. What are our steps towards helping the students to understand the value of the knowledge?
For our approach for adventure education and kind of basing everything off that same mindset that adventure educators, that expedition leaders, outdoor educators have to have. I mean, I would always, like, as we talk to teachers, say like, hey, well, start with what is your own purpose for teaching? And there are a couple teachers out there that are maybe a little more of like the college professor mindset, that like they teach social studies because that is their only passion in life and they think that should be the most interesting thing to everybody. And that might be a little difficult, but the vast majority of, secondary and even primary teachers, no, like we said in one of our other videos, like nobody has ever answered the question, why did you become a teacher? With the answer like, well, ever since I was young, I wanted to increase standardized scores by a certain percentage each year for a pay raise. Like you started as
Right.
a teacher because you want to, educate, inspire, see that spark in students' eyes, like all those things that,
Right. Make a difference in the lives of the next generation.
right, yeah. And I mean, that's our 10th generation idea, is like you want to influence your students so much that you've altered the course of their life and then the lives of every generation, to follow for 10 generations. And having that kind of impact that lasts for the next 500-600 years or whatever, like that's where we want to get the profession. That's where we want teachers to be thinking, not like, hey, will they be ready for this test in 3 weeks? But like, is the way I'm structuring my class and my activities altering my, like, the vast majority of my students for the next 500 years through their progeny, essentially. But yeah, to start with, ask yourself as a teacher, what is your own purpose for teaching? Like, why do you teach social studies? Why do you teach math? Why do you teach physics? And even like, something straightforward like physics, where it's so that they can answer physics questions. For me, when I taught physics, it was always like, I taught physics because I wanted to give students a better understanding of the physical world around them, and let them understand some of the basic things that happen in life around them. Like, why are highway exits tilted, and all of these things that explain basic parts of the universe around them. But for every teacher, like, there's got to be a reason you love your subject. What is it that inspires you about your subject? Why do you love it? And what is your real purpose for teaching? And at TS Fires, of course, ours is, we believe education exists to develop people to their fullest potential as individuals and as members of a larger society.
Yeah, we were talking about this a little bit before we hit record. And education, I think organized education is the greatest invention that humanity has ever come up with. It's how we get better as a society from one generation to the next. And it's the most inspiring thing to be part of. It's to part of this mission of like bettering humanity. Education is amazing. And yeah.
Right. And I mean, the ability to have generational learning where your students, like your kids, can learn everything that the tribe has learned in the past 1,000 years, and you can teach that to them by the time they're 12. Like, that ability to transmit a large amount of generational knowledge into a single person, so that they can kind of, start 1,000 years ahead and then build from there. Like, that's what made humanity different from every other species that, like, maybe has some instincts, can teach a couple basic things to their next generation, but they can't teach 1,000 years worth of learning to the next generation of mountain lions or, rabbits or whatever.
I don't think that would work out very well.
Right. And, so the fact that like we've now have this giant system to transmit knowledge, and growth potential to the next generation is incredible, but we really have to start capturing it, right?
Right.
And so that's when we, like, the second question we ask, like, as a teacher, if you've established your own purpose for teaching, the second question then is like, what are you really teaching, right? And we always focus on knowledge, skills, and attitude as a teacher. And I think knowledge is the obvious one, right? You can look at your syllabus, you can look at exactly what you're teaching and see like, okay, this is the knowledge that we're teaching, these are the facts we're teaching. but at the same time, skills like the actual hands-on things they're leaving from the classroom with, and then attitude is the biggest one as well. And if you're not actually teaching all of those, and I think skills and attitude, like skills especially, we always talk about cognitive skills even, right? Like no matter what you're teaching your students the ability to think and to memorize and to organize and analyze and categorize and evaluate. And basically like all of Bloom's taxonomy, those are neurological and kind of cognitive skills that we're teaching. And then an important part too is attitude, which unfortunately we almost ignore now, it seems. But past maybe kindergarten, where we all know we're teaching how to share and listen, and why it's good to listen to a teacher. But after that, like attitude just almost never shows up in the curriculum anymore.
Right. We teach attitude by punishing people if they step out of line.
Yeah, yeah, or and that's kind of like what we talked about earlier. That idea of if you tell students like, well, it does kind of suck, but we just got to learn it to get ready for the test. Like that's the attitude you're teaching. Is like you're right, what we're doing sucks, and sometimes stuff is gonna suck, and I still show up to work every day, and like you're teaching students that as an attitude. And for me, it's just like, is what I'm giving to my students each day, is that attitude? If every student, or if 70% of the students in the country had that attitude, would our country be a better place? And I find it really hard to argue that like sort of apathy towards learning and doing stuff would be a beneficial attitude.
Right. But we've had this system for so long that a lot of people just assume that it's the only way to do it.
Right, and it kind of gets transmitted accidentally, and that's like the beautiful part of being a human being, is that each day you can wake up and essentially choose what attitude you want to have. And we don't even teach students that. Like I remember a lot of the Title I students, I was lucky enough to have kind of this elective class where we taught, a lot of cognitive skills. And we would even like, we did this activity that was like your toolbox, right? And you talk about like the knowledge, the skills, and the attitude that you're going into the world with. And a lot of students never even realized, but like you have them write down like what parts of your attitude make you better equipped to handle life than a lot of people. And that was the first time that a lot of these students, really thought about the fact that like they'd overcome hardships, and the fact that like they're good at putting up with like hard times at home, essentially, that was going to be a benefit to them in the rest of the world. And we don't even focus on that, let alone teaching people how to then choose which attitudes they want. And I remember one student who was very smart and was actually college bound, was one of like the 5 or 6 graduating members who were college bound at our school, and still was like, was spending a couple weeks like being angry at the teachers that were helping him and all these things. And, and he had a lot of tough background and reasons to be angry. But one of the classes then, it was like, look, you can like each day practice being grateful and having gratitude. And if you're having gratitude, it's really difficult for you to be angry. And he came up after and was like, oh man, I felt like that was just to me, even though it was like a full class. He's like, I realized I was choosing anger every day instead of gratitude. And I don't think, that's not really teaching any specific belief system or anything like that, but like turning out a generation of students that knows that they can choose gratitude instead of anger, that's a pretty valuable part of what you can do.
Absolutely. So can you give another good example like that about how you would use that knowledge, skills, and attitude framework to answer the question of like, why do I have to learn this?
Yeah, so I mean, for me, when a student came up and said, why do I have to learn this? You first like, what is your purpose for teaching, right? So developing them to lead their fullest life, to have the most joy, the most fulfillment, right? To climb up Maslow's hierarchy, towards self-actualization, towards kind of enlightenment, all that, right? What are you really teaching them? Think about your knowledge, your skills, and your attitude that you're teaching them. And that way you can answer more than one thing, right? And if you realize you're only teaching knowledge, then maybe you need to add a little bit to your classroom. But to me, you then like do a similar process with the student, is like, so, okay, so your purpose for teaching, the knowledge, skills, and attitude that you're actually teaching. So ask the student, like, hey, what's a goal that you have, right? Because that was the big one. Students would come up and say, hey, my goal is to work on cars, or I want to be a famous rapper. Why do I need to know about history? And there are a few answers that I would always give. But for me, it's kind of like each day in class, you're telling them that you're like help them share that same purpose. Like, look, school is not just to pass this test, right? That's kind of how we measure it. But the purpose of school is to help you grow and have the best life that you can possibly have. And it's really hard for a student to be like, well, I don't want to have the best life, right? And actually, another commenter, kind of they put up there in terms of cognitive skills that very few students will try to argue, well, it's better to be dumb, right? Like, there's not a good argument for that. It's also hard for students to be like, well, it's better to be unhappy, right? And so talk about like, what is your goal? And so even the students that are like, well, rap artists need clever references, I always had them think about, and this is the same thing we do in adventure
Yeah.
education, right? You have them climb a rope or climb rocks or shoot archery. And at the end of it, you give that reflective period that says like, okay, what about shooting archery can you apply to your team? Right? Because it was normally teamwork. But you can also say, like, okay, what about the thing we did in history today or the last week of social studies? What have we learned that you could apply to, let's say, their goal? They say, like, well, I want to be a really good big sister or I want to be a really good daughter. A lot of family ties were, really common and important at the school I was at. So they're like, well, I don't really care about school. I just want to be a really amazing mom. You're like, okay, like, yeah, you want to be an amazing mom. Um, but do you think there's any knowledge in the world that might help you be a better mom? And they're like, oh, okay. Do you think there are any skills that could help you be a better mom? Do you think that being able to, do math at the grocery store, being able to organize your thoughts would help you be a better mom? And have them reflect on real life. Like, have you ever seen one of your friends be a mother who's not a very good mom? Have you ever met not a very good mom because they didn't know enough to help? And almost always it's like, oh, actually, yeah, I know a mom that doesn't know very much and can't help, right? So, same process. Why, what is your goal of being in school? Why is it that you're in school? What are you doing here? What are your goals? And then kind of, do you have knowledge that might help you with that goal? Do you have any skills that might help you with that goal? Do you have any attitudes that might help you with that goal, right? And even the student that's like, yo, I want to be a famous rapper. It's like, well, okay, rappers all the time get taken advantage of because they don't understand their contracts. Do you think being able to read a contract and make sure that you got $10 million instead of a Ferrari that's only worth 100 grand, do you think that would be a good skill to have? And then the same thing in attitude. you know are there any attitudes that would make you a better mom or make you a better sister or make you a better rapper? Or even the idea of like, I'm going to be a nail technician, and one of the other elements I talked about, which shows up, is that essentially education is kind of a test to see if you belong in some places. That like, just like, and a lot of students get this. I talk about like, hey, have you ever been somewhere and known that if you were dressed up better, you would fit in better, right? That you'd be allowed in. And they all have some explanation, whether it's a restaurant or whether it's a restaurant they work at or they've been to once, or, even like places downtown, or the straightforward, like a lot of them are like, yeah, at nightclubs, I'm not allowed to wear jerseys and I can't have tattoos on my neck. Obviously, I have slightly older students, but they understand that idea of like, hey, if you don't put tattoos on your neck, there are places you can get into in life that you can't if you do that, right? And that being educated is essentially like a dress code for your mind, that there are going to be places throughout your life that if you are better educated and you have these references and maybe you can make a Shakespeare joke or at least understand a reference or whatever, that's like dressing up, and there's going to be things you can do no matter what your goals are that you couldn't have done otherwise.
Okay, so it sounds like what you're saying is, I'm gonna to condense a lot of this into one thought. It sounds like there isn't one quick pithy response that you can give to a student who's asking why that thing is relevant. Like a student says, well, why do I need to learn how to calculate for acceleration in physics, right? There's not like a one sentence response. It's more of it's a process that you should be implementing in your classroom, uh, so that the question doesn't necessarily come up, or when it does, there's more context to reference the student to different things and different ideas that they've been working on.
Yeah, and I mean, I think boiling anything down to the single pithy response is where we get in trouble a lot, right? And I mean, as teachers, I think we could relate to that from our admin, is that admin comes up with some new program, and very often, unfortunately, the answer you get kind of like, why are we trying this new program? And the answer it will get boiled down for the same reasons of like simplicity and just being in charge is easier than getting people on board with you. But we know that doesn't really work on expeditions, right? If somebody says like, hey, why do we have to filter this water? And you're like, well, because I told you to. you're really likely to get some kids that are like, well, you're not the boss of me. I'm not gonna do this just because you told me to, and then everybody gets giardia, right? And the same thing happens, like, we all know that if admin just tells us like, well, we're gonna do this because I told you to, and I'm your boss, especially if it's a 25-year-old principal or whatever, a 30-year-old principal, and you have some 50-year-old teachers who've been there as way longer than the teachers almost, or the principal's almost been alive, and they're just like, hey, I'm the boss, so we're going to do this. You're going to have a lot of giardia, essentially. You're going to have a lot of poisoning of people just ignoring the instructions, even though there was a good idea, right? So taking that extra time to make sure your students are actually on board with what you're doing is important, right? And I think it's just like filtering water, that if you were like, hey, we're going to, line all our tents up so they face north and south, and the students were like, why are we doing that? And you don't have a reason because there is no reason, then it's a dumb rule and you shouldn't do it anymore, right? And I think if we maybe thought through our actions a little more in the classroom, you might have some activities or some curriculum that we were changing. But as is, if you believe in your curriculum and you believe in your subject, even if you don't have full control over exactly what you're teaching, then having that conversation to bring students along with you to a place where they understand why you're doing it makes a lot more sense, and you'll start to get onto our expedition mindset, where you are building a dynamic team as a classroom going on a journey, instead of you being in charge of a bunch of prison inmates, essentially.
Right. Right. What you're saying is that as teachers, we can work to build buy-in to where the students are with us in the process and they understand the context for the knowledge, rather than just, well, studying because they
Right.
are
Yeah, and
obligated
I
to.
mean, in
Yeah.
the last, so
Just,
we've
yeah.
got, only a couple minutes here left, but the quick version of just like, and we've addressed like, how do you answer this question? And you should have a conversation with your class or with that individual student, like tie it back, make it relevant to their own life, right? In the same way that if, like if somebody says, why are you a teacher? And you're like, because my principal told me to, you're probably not really thinking about why you're a teacher, and you probably don't have that same sense of fulfillment that a lot of teachers who can tell you exactly, why they're a teacher, have that level of fulfillment that they might have. But so the last couple minutes here, like, one way to start, double checking that maybe you'll have a little more engagement and interaction on that is kind of our basis for what makes adventure activities in a classroom, right? Or it's the same idea of the expedition mindset, is like, what makes it so that on a camping trip, nobody ever says like, well, why do I need to learn to pitch a tent, or why do I need to get the water, right? Because you're using it immediately. But taking these activities and making sure that whatever you're teaching, there's like an actual physical skill related to it somehow, even if it's sort of cognitive and on paper, but have some kind of physical skill related to that. Make sure it's immediately applicable, so they're actually using it ideally to solve a problem or to work as a team, and break whatever you're doing into smaller engaging activities. In the same way that, like, you set up a tent and maybe you make a race to set up tents and take them down, but never do you do a tent worksheet where you just set up 40 tents in a row that are slightly different and then take them all down. That would be boring and dumb, and yet that's what we've done to academics, right? So instead, like, right, like, have a good
That's a
solid
good
tent
example.
that you set up, and then you take it back down, and then you go and apply it somewhere, right? And the same idea, focus. We always say focus on the journey or the destination, the journey or the moment, not the destination. And that idea is like, on an expedition, the same idea as a classroom. Like, for all you know, your school will get destroyed in a hailstorm, like a couple schools did for us a year ago in Colorado. Like, maybe at winter break, your roof will collapse and school will be done for the year, and your students won't even get to finish, right? Or the school gets closed for flooding, or you move away, or your students move away, whatever. But for each student that comes up and says like, hey, why are we learning this? Saying like, well, because eventually there will be a test at the end of high school, the SAT, ACT, and you have to get a good score. That's like, it's just not a good reason, right? Like, the actual thing you're doing in the classroom each day, at the end of the day, should have been a good day, right? Even if some days are hard, even if you're exhausted, at the end of every single day, it shouldn't matter if the park ranger shows up and says like, sorry guys, there's a forest fire coming and your trip is done and you don't get to climb the mountain and you don't get to your destination. You still had 3 really great days of hiking into the destination. And so that kind of idea, if the park ranger shows up or your school hails out and you're closed for the year, did the things you do in your classroom so far let your children grow as individuals and as citizens? Or were you so focused on the destination that you didn't enjoy the journey at all?
Yeah, and if anybody is listening to this and they're wondering how they can learn more about what we're talking about here, and is really, Jesse, you're just scratching the surface of this. So we have that we're just starting this week,
October 9th.
which is today is October the 9th, 2018. What's today? This is the first week that we're starting our coaching and adventure consulting program, and the first cohort is beginning this week. So you can go ahead and go to the website and apply to join this cohort. If you don't get it in time for this one, we'll very likely do another cohort after this, so it's not too late. And you just go to www.tsfires.com/invitation. You can consider this your official personal invitation to the coaching program. And it's going to be great. We're going to do a real deep dive into this expedition mindset that Jesse mentioned briefly during this podcast. We're going to talk about adventure activities and how to make your own and how to apply them in your classroom. It's going to be really great. It's going to be very condensed and quick and fast paced, but you'll have the recordings from the training so you can review them afterwards as well. So it's going to be a lot of information packed into a short amount of time, and partly because we value your time and we know that teachers don't have a lot of it. So we want to make sure you get as much value as possible from the training. But it's going to be great. It's something that we've been working on for some time, and we're really proud and excited to offer it to everybody. So
yeah, since it is the trial version here, participation this time is totally free. We're trying to get a little more feedback. So as this cohort fills up, we might do one more cohort. But we want to be able to, in this version, really like learn who we're working with and direct the conversation a little bit more towards you specifically, and be able to have actual like one-on-one phone calls with people. We're pretty excited. I think we already have teachers on 3 continents, right, Austin, signed up?
Yep. We're on 3
some people
continents right now.
teaching English abroad, and just teaching in other countries, which is pretty exciting. But please do sign up. So again, it's www.tsfires.com/invitation. And you can also see a little bit more just at tsfires.com. And we've got a blog at teachersstartingfires.com. We would love to get in touch with you. With that, remember, you're only one adventure away, and thank you so much for listening to the Teachers Starting Fires podcast series.